Christmas Eve had always been sacred to me, even if not to them. I woke up before the sun, as I had every year since marrying into the Thompson family, and began cooking while humming quietly to myself. The kitchen in our Westport home was still dark, illuminated only by the soft glow of the under-cabinet lights I'd switched on. Outside, the Connecticut snow fell silently, covering our driveway in a blanket of white that would need clearing before guests arrived. I pulled out the family recipes I'd collected over our 7 years of marriage, recipes Richard's mother, Elaine, had reluctantly shared with obvious omissions that ensured my versions never quite matched hers. Still, I tried each year, desperately hoping to create some sliver of warmth in a house that never truly welcomed me. The turkey needed to be perfect. The stuffing needed to be moist, but not soggy. The cranberry sauce couldn't be too tart or too sweet. I knew the drill by now. Each dish was a potential criticism. Each plate a battlefield where I fought for approval I never received. "You're up early," Richard mumbled, shuffling into the kitchen in his expensive pajamas, the ones his mother had given him last Christmas. He didn't offer to help, just poured himself coffee from the pot I'd already brewed. "Lots to do," I replied, keeping my voice light, pretending this was normal, that it was normal for a husband to watch his wife work herself to exhaustion while he sipped coffee and scrolled through his phone. By 9, I had polished the silver cutlery that had belonged to Richard's grandmother, folded the napkins into crisp triangles, and arranged the centerpiece of pine and holly I'd stayed up late making the night before. The dining room looked beautiful, the kind of Christmas scene you'd see in a magazine, but I felt like a shadow moving through my own home, setting the stage for a performance where I was merely the stagehand. The doorbell rang at 10. Elaine never waited for our agreed time of 11. She liked to arrive early to help, which meant inspecting everything I'd done and making small adjustments to remind me that I would never quite get it right. "Darling!" she exclaimed, embracing Richard while barely glancing my way. She handed me her coat without looking at me, already launching into a story about her bridge partner's holiday disaster. Poor Martha simply doesn't understand that you can't use store-bought pastry for a proper Wellington. I hung up her designer coat and returned to the kitchen, where I still had a dozen tasks to complete. Through the doorway, I could see Richard pouring his mother a glass of the expensive wine we were supposed to be saving for dinner. They settled in the living room, laughing about something they wouldn't let me in on. Every few minutes, Elaine would call out a question about dinner, or a reminder about someone's dietary preferences that I was already well aware of. "Make sure you don't overcook the turkey this year, Sarah," she called, her voice dripping with false concern. Judge Pearson was so polite about it last year, but I could tell he was disappointed. I kept working, trying to focus on the details, convincing myself that my efforts mattered. The sweet potatoes needed to be candied just right. The green beans needed to be crisp. The pies, apple and pumpkin, had been baked the night before and just needed warming. I worked methodically, the way I approached everything in my life with the Thompsons, with precision, care, and the desperate hope that this time they might see me. By noon, the house was filled with the familiar faces of Richard's colleagues from the law firm, his mother's friends from the country club, and a few neighbors who belonged to the right social circles. I smiled politely and poured drinks, receiving barely a nod in return. The women clustered around Elaine in the living room, admiring her new diamond bracelet. The men gathered with Richard near the fireplace, discussing golf handicaps and stock portfolios. I tried not to notice how no one acknowledged the work I had done. Instead, all eyes turned toward my husband and his mother, as if they were the ones who made the night happen. But I held my tongue, as I always had, hoping still that kindness might be returned someday. "Sarah, dear," Elaine's voice cut through my thoughts as I arranged the last of the appetizers on a silver tray. "Judge Pearson was just asking about your little online business. I told him it's just a hobby, of course. My little online business was a successful consulting firm that had helped Richard's law practice establish its digital presence and streamline its operations. I had a master's degree in business that no one in this room ever seemed to remember. But I smiled and nodded, used to having my achievements minimized. "It keeps me busy," I said, placing the tray on the coffee table. Judge Pearson barely looked up from his conversation with Richard. As the afternoon wore on, I felt myself becoming more and more invisible. I moved between kitchen and dining room, putting final touches on dishes, refilling glasses, and maintaining the perfect hostess smile that had become my armor. No one seemed to notice that I hadn't sat down once, hadn't eaten a single bite of the food I'd spent days preparing. "Everything looks lovely," whispered Margaret, one of the few kind souls in Richard's circle. She was a partner at a competing firm who had always treated me with respect. "You've outdone yourself." Her words were a small lifeline in a sea of indifference. I thanked her quietly, grateful for the acknowledgement. When it came time to be seated for dinner, Richard called for everyone's attention with the casual confidence of a man who has never doubted his place in the world. He stood at the head of the table, a position he claimed despite never having cooked a single dish, and raised his glass. "To another wonderful Christmas Eve," he said, smiling broadly at his mother and barely glancing my way. "Mom, you've outdone yourself with the planning this year." I felt my smile freeze on my face as several guests murmured their agreement. Elaine beamed at her son, accepting praise for work she hadn't done. I remained standing by the kitchen door, the last dish of roasted potatoes still warm in my oven-mitted hands, suddenly feeling every second of the 18 hours I'd been awake and working. But I said nothing. I simply placed the dish on the table and took my seat at the far end, opposite from where Richard and Elaine sat together, laughing and clinking glasses as if they were the hosts, and I was merely another guest. As the main course plates were being cleared away, I felt the familiar ache in my lower back from standing all day. The conversation around the table had shifted to politics, always a safe topic in this homogeneous crowd where everyone shared the same conservative views and country club memberships. I excused myself to bring out the desserts, but no one seemed to notice me leaving. In the kitchen, I took a moment to steady myself, leaning against the cool marble countertop. My reflection in the window showed a woman I barely recognized anymore. Perfectly styled hair, carefully applied makeup, and eyes that had lost their spark years ago. When had I stopped being Sarah Miller, the ambitious business graduate from Boston University, and become simply Richard's wife? I arranged the desserts on serving plates, the apple pie, the pumpkin pie, and the chocolate torte that had taken me 3 attempts to perfect, each one garnished with care. Each one another opportunity for subtle criticism. I lit the small cinnamon-scented candles I'd placed around the dining room earlier, hoping to create the perfect ambiance for the final course. As I returned to the dining room carrying the apple pie, Richard cleared his throat and stood up again. Something about his expression made me pause. There was a gleam in his eye that I recognized, the same look he had when he was about to close a deal or deliver what he thought was a particularly clever argument in court. "Before we move on to dessert," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of a man who spoke in courtrooms, "Mom and I have a special surprise for Sarah." The room fell silent. Elaine was smiling, but it wasn't her usual social smile. This one had an edge to it, a satisfied curl at the corners that made my stomach tighten. I set the pie down on the sideboard, wiping my hands nervously on the back of my dress, a gesture that made Elaine's smile widen. Richard moved to stand beside his mother, who reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped box. The wrapping paper was elegant, silver with subtle snowflakes, tied with a perfect blue bow, the kind of wrapping you might see on an expensive piece of jewelry. "Sarah," Richard said with theatrical cheer, "Mom and I wanted to give you something special this year, to show our appreciation for everything you do around here." A murmur of approval rippled through the guests. Someone said, "How thoughtful." I felt a flicker of hope. Could this be a genuine gesture of thanks? Had they finally noticed my efforts, my sacrifices, my constant attempts to please? I approached them slowly, conscious of all eyes on me. Judge Pearson was watching with mild interest. Margaret looked concerned, though I couldn't understand why. Richard's law partner, David, was smirking into his wine glass as if he was in on a joke I hadn't heard yet. Richard handed me the box with a flourish. "Open it," he urged, his voice carrying a hint of eagerness that should have warned me. I peeled back the wrapping carefully, my fingers trembling slightly. The box underneath was black velvet, like a jewelry box. For a brief, foolish moment, I imagined it might contain the tennis bracelet I'd admired months ago at Tiffany's, the one Richard had dismissed as unnecessary when I'd pointed it out. When I lifted the lid, however, I found no bracelet, no necklace, no token of appreciation. Inside was a plain kitchen apron. Cheap fabric, beige and stiff, the kind you might find at a dollar store. It wasn't even new. I could see a small stain near the bottom hem. On top of it lay a handwritten note in Elaine's perfect cursive. "Now you're finally where you belong." I felt the blood rush from my face. The room seemed to tilt slightly. A quiet gasp rose from someone down the table. Margaret, perhaps. But the room remained otherwise still. I looked up to see Richard chuckling, his eyes crinkling with amusement. Elaine beamed beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm. They both looked at me with a kind of smug satisfaction I had never seen so plainly displayed. In that moment, the mask dropped completely. This wasn't thoughtlessness or casual disregard. This was deliberate humiliation. They had planned this, wrapped it beautifully, and presented it in front of everyone we knew to make sure I understood exactly what they thought of me. "Well?" Richard prompted when I didn't speak. "Aren't you going to try it on?" "Mom picked it out specially." Elaine nodded. I saw it and thought, that's perfect for Sarah. Simple, practical. Nothing fancy needed for kitchen work, right? I heard David snicker. Judge Pearson coughed uncomfortably. The Wilsons from next door exchanged glances. They all knew what was happening. A public reminder of my place in this household. Not a partner, not an equal, but the help. The woman who cooked and cleaned and smiled and never complained. I didn't say a word. I nodded once, closed the box gently, and placed it beside my plate at the far end of the table. No tears, no confrontation, no spectacle. I simply walked to the sideboard, picked up the apple pie I'd set down, and began serving it as if nothing had happened. "Sarah makes the most wonderful apple pie," Elaine said brightly, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "It's almost as good as my mother's recipe." Conversations resumed slowly, awkwardly at first, then with increasing volume as everyone tried to pretend they hadn't witnessed my humiliation. I moved mechanically around the table, serving dessert, refilling coffee cups, smiling emptily at murmured thanks. Inside, though, something had changed. The pain I felt wasn't the usual ache of being overlooked or underappreciated. This was sharper, cleaner somehow. This was the pain of finally seeing the truth without any softening filters. They would never respect me. They would never value me. In their eyes, I would always be the hired help who had somehow tricked their son into marriage. As I worked, a strange calm began to settle over me. I felt detached, as if I were watching myself from across the room. This woman in her carefully chosen dress, with her perfect makeup and hollow smile, serving people who saw her as nothing more than hands to carry plates and a body to warm one side of Richard's bed. I noticed things I'd never allowed myself to fully see before. How Richard never once looked at me with warmth, only with assessment or criticism. How Elaine's friends evaluated my home as if taking inventory of things that should rightfully belong to someone else. How the entire evening was a performance in which I was cast as both stagehand and villain. Necessary but contemptible. The apron sat in its box by my plate, untouched. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me react. Instead, I served dessert, poured coffee, and listened to conversations about vacation homes and boarding schools, with a placid expression that revealed nothing of the storm brewing inside me. By the time the last guest left, close to midnight, my face ached from smiling. Richard was pleasantly drunk, laughing too loudly as he showed Judge Pearson out. Elaine lingered, watching me collect dirty glasses from the living room. "You really should use that apron," she said, her voice honey-sweet with malice. "Might save that dress. Though I never understood why you spend so much on clothes no one really notices." I met her eyes for perhaps the first time that night. Something in my gaze must have unsettled her because she blinked rapidly and looked away. "Thank you for the gift, Elaine," I said quietly. It was very revealing. She left shortly after, kissing Richard on both cheeks and ignoring me completely. As the door closed behind her, Richard turned to me with the satisfied expression of a man who believes the day has gone exactly as it should. "Good party," he said, loosening his tie. "Make sure you get those wine glasses clean tonight. They water spot if you leave them." Then he headed upstairs, not waiting for a response, not offering to help with the destruction that remained of our dining room, not thanking me for 18 hours of work. The last thing he said before disappearing upstairs was, "Don't forget to put the garbage out." I stood in the living room, surrounded by the debris of a party thrown in a home where I was less than a guest, and felt something inside me break completely. But it wasn't sadness that filled the broken places. It was clarity. I moved through the house like a ghost, gathering plates and glasses, scraping leftover food into the garbage. The expensive china clinked softly as I stacked it in the dishwasher. From upstairs came the sound of the shower running, then the television in our bedroom. Richard had already forgotten about me, secure in his world where everything would be clean and perfect by morning, as if by magic. My hands worked automatically, scrubbing pots and wiping down counters while my mind raced. 7 years. 7 years of gradually disappearing, of shrinking myself to fit into smaller and smaller spaces in my own life. I remembered the woman I'd been when we met. Confident, ambitious, full of plans. I'd been finishing my MBA at Boston University, presenting my thesis on digital transformation in traditional businesses. Richard had been in the audience, a young lawyer representing a firm interested in my research. He'd seemed so different then, impressed by my ideas, enthusiastic about my career plans. He'd pursued me with the same intensity he brought to his legal cases. I'd been flattered, enchanted by his confidence and the world he represented. So different from my middle-class upbringing in Maine, where my father taught high school English and my mother ran a small bookstore. When had it changed? Was it when we moved to Connecticut to be closer to his family? When I put my consulting business on hold to help him establish his position at his father's law firm? Or had it always been there? This dismissive attitude, this fundamental lack of respect, just hidden beneath charm and ambition? By midnight, the kitchen was spotless. The dining room was restored to its magazine-perfect state. The living room showed no sign of the crowd that had filled it hours before. I stood in the silence, exhausted but unable to face going upstairs, unable to lie beside him and pretend everything was normal. Instead, I went to my small home office. Richard called it my craft room, though I'd never crafted anything in my life. It was where I ran my consulting business, the business that had helped streamline his law firm's operations, that had built their client portal, that had quietly made me more money last year than his junior partner salary, though he didn't know that part. I kept my consulting work separate from our joint accounts. At first, it had been to maintain a sense of independence. Later, as I began to see the reality of my marriage, it became a secret safety net. I'd been careful, diverting most of my earnings to a private account in my maiden name at a bank across town. I opened my laptop, the soft glow illuminating the dark room. The apron and its notes sat on my desk, where I'd placed them after retrieving the box from the dining room. "Now you're finally where you belong." I read it again, feeling strangely calm. The words had lost their power to hurt me. Instead, they had become a catalyst, the final push I needed to make a decision I'd been avoiding for years. I pulled up my files and began reviewing everything: our joint accounts, property deeds, business documents. Over the past few years, I'd helped Richard set up his small legal practice separate from his father's firm. I'd co-signed on loans for the office space, put my name on every major asset to protect him from potential bankruptcy if a case went wrong. What he never realized was that, in doing so, he had handed me the reins. I had power. Real, legal, quiet power. I worked methodically, compiling documents, creating secure backups, drafting emails. I'd always been organized. It was one of the traits Richard had once claimed to admire before he began using it to exploit me. Now that same trait would be my salvation. At 1:30 a.m., I heard Richard snoring. I slipped upstairs and quietly packed a suitcase. Nothing obvious, just enough clothes for a few days. My important documents. The few pieces of jewelry that had been gifts from my parents rather than from Richard or Elaine. I didn't take much. Material things had never mattered to me the way they mattered to the Thompsons, who measured worth by brand names and price tags. My wedding ring caught the dim light as I worked. I twisted it thoughtfully, remembering the day Richard had placed it on my finger with promises of partnership and respect. Empty words. I slipped it off and placed it on his bedside table. He didn't stir. Back in my office, I finished drafting 3 crucial emails, attaching all necessary documentation. The first was addressed to our lawyer, detailing the dissolution of our business partnership, and the activation of clauses in our agreements that would freeze all business assets pending review. The second went to our accountant, requesting a complete audit of all business accounts and formally withdrawing my consent for certain financial arrangements Richard had set up. The third was to the small board of directors for Richard's law practice, mostly friends of his father's who had invested in his venture, outlining certain discrepancies I'd discovered and suggesting they might want to look more closely at the books. I scheduled all three to be sent at 6 a.m. sharp, early enough to catch everyone before the workday began, but late enough that Richard wouldn't have time to counter before the business day started. Perfect timing had always been one of my strengths. Next, I made a few calls. Difficult to do in the middle of the night, but necessary. I'd prepared for this possibility, though I hadn't known when or if I would act on it. The apartment was waiting for me in Boston, rented under my maiden name. A job offer I'd been considering for months could be accepted with a single email. A car service could pick me up at 5:30 a.m., before Richard or the neighbors would be awake. Everything was arranged with the same careful attention to detail I'd always brought to managing our lives. But this time, the beneficiary of my planning would be me alone. At 2 a.m., I stood in the kitchen once more, staring at the sink full of foam and the Christmas candles still glowing on the windowsill. The apron was in my hands again. I ran my fingers over the cheap fabric, feeling a strange gratitude toward it. Without this insult, this blatant display of disrespect, how much longer might I have continued pretending? How many more years would I have wasted trying to earn the approval of people who saw me as nothing more than convenient labor? I folded the apron neatly and tied it with a red ribbon from the Christmas decorations. On the back of Elaine's note, I wrote a short message. I know exactly where I belong. It's not here. I left the apron on the living room couch, where Richard would see it first thing in the morning. Then I went upstairs to shower, washing away the lingering scent of cinnamon and pine, the sweat of a day spent cooking and serving, and smiling through humiliation. When I came back to our bedroom, Richard was still snoring, one arm flung across what should have been my side of the bed. I looked at him, really looked at him, for what I knew would be the last time. His handsome face was slack with sleep and too much wine. There was gray in his hair now that hadn't been there when we met, lines around his eyes from squinting at legal documents and frowning at subordinates. He looked older, harder, or perhaps I was just finally seeing him clearly. I lay down on the very edge of the bed, not touching him, my body still and tense. In a few hours, I would be gone. In a few hours, everything would change. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about the woman I had been before I met Richard, the woman I had allowed myself to become with him, and the woman I might yet be once I was free. My mind was spinning with details and plans, anticipating Richard's reactions, preparing countermoves like a chess player thinking several steps ahead. But beneath the strategic thinking, a strange sense of peace was growing. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad. I was simply awake, aware, ready. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 3:14 a.m. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to rest. In less than 3 hours, my life would begin again. My breathing slowed, and for the first time in years, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. Whatever came next, the confrontations, the legal battles, the gossip and recriminations, I would face it standing tall, not bowing under the weight of others' expectations. The apron had been meant as a collar, a way to mark me as property, as a servant. Instead, it had become a key, unlocking the door to my freedom. I almost smiled at the irony. Tomorrow, no, today, would bring chaos for Richard and Elaine. Their carefully ordered world, maintained by my invisible labor, would begin to crumble, and I would not be there to pick up the pieces. I had spent too long living in the shadows of their making. It was time to step into a light of my own. I must have dozed off despite my racing mind, because the next thing I knew, the bedside clock read 5:15 a.m. I slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Richard. My suitcase was already hidden in my office, ready to go. I dressed quickly in the bathroom. Jeans, a sweater, comfortable boots. Clothes for my real life, not the Connecticut socialite costume I'd been wearing for years. The house was silent and dark as I made one final sweep, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything essential. In the kitchen, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. How many meals had I prepared here? How many times had I stood at this counter, chopping vegetables, kneading dough, stirring sauces, all the while shrinking smaller and smaller inside? The granite countertops gleamed in the dim light, expensive and cold, just like everything else in this house. I made a cup of coffee, my last in this kitchen, and stood by the window, watching the snow continue to fall. The Christmas lights from neighboring houses created colorful reflections on the white ground. It looked peaceful, perfect, just like the facade of my marriage. At exactly 5:30 a.m., my phone vibrated with a text from the car service. The driver was waiting at the end of our long driveway. Lights off, as I'd requested. I grabbed my coat, picked up my purse and the small overnight bag I'd prepared, and took one last look around. Nothing here belonged to me. Not really. Even the things I'd chosen had been selected to please Richard or impress Elaine. I was leaving with less than I'd brought to this marriage, and yet I felt lighter than I had in years. I slipped out the side door, the one that didn't creak, and walked carefully down the snow-covered path. The air was biting cold, the kind of New England winter morning that steals your breath, but I welcomed it. The sharp clarity of the cold matched my state of mind perfectly. The driver took my bag without a word and opened the car door. As we pulled away, I didn't look back at the house. Instead, I watched the time on my phone. At exactly 6:00 a.m., as we merged onto the highway heading toward Boston, I felt a small thrill knowing my emails had just been delivered. The dismantling of Richard Thompson's carefully constructed world had begun. At 6:04 a.m., my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Richard. I declined it and put my phone on silent. A minute later, it lit up again. And again. Then came the text messages, first confused, then demanding, then desperate. I read them without responding, watching his realization unfold in real time. What's going on? The lawyer just called. Sarah, what the hell did you do? Answer your phone. Where are you? You can't do this. You have no right. My mother is calling. What did you tell her? This is insane. Come back right now and we can fix this. You're making a huge mistake. The last message made me smile. No, Richard. The mistake was made 7 years ago when I walked down the aisle to you. I switched off my phone and watched the snow-covered Connecticut landscape slide past the car window. We were heading north on I-95, making good time in the early morning hours. My new apartment in Boston wouldn't be ready until noon, but I'd arranged to meet an old college friend for breakfast in Cambridge. Melissa had been trying to get me to leave Richard for years. She'd be pleased to see me with a suitcase in tow. By 7:30 a.m., we were approaching New Haven. I turned my phone back on briefly to check the status of my morning's work. My inbox was flooded. The lawyer had sent a formal acknowledgement of my instructions. The accountant had already frozen the accounts and was requesting an emergency meeting. 2 board members had responded with alarm, demanding explanations from Richard. Everything was proceeding exactly as I'd planned. There were 17 missed calls from Richard and 12 from Elaine. I turned the phone off again. They'd have to wait for my response. For once, I would not be jumping to attention at their summons. The car radio was playing Christmas carols. "It's the most wonderful time of the year," filled the quiet space, and I found myself smiling at the irony. Perhaps it was, after all. We reached Cambridge just after 8:00 a.m. Melissa was already waiting at the small cafe we'd agreed on, a look of concern on her face that turned to relief when she saw me walk through the door. "You actually did it," she said, standing to hug me. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I admitted, settling into the chair across from her. But it was time. Over coffee and pancakes, I told her everything. The years of subtle erosion, the Christmas Eve party, the apron. Melissa listened without interrupting, though her expressive face showed every emotion from outrage to satisfaction as my story unfolded. "So, what happens now?" she asked when I'd finished. "Now?" I took a sip of my coffee. "Now I rebuild. I've accepted that position at Mercer Consulting. My apartment will be ready at noon. And as for Richard," I shrugged. "Now he learns what happens when you underestimate the woman who's been keeping your life running." My phone, which I'd placed on the table, lit up with another call. This time it wasn't Richard or Elaine, but David, Richard's law partner. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. "Sarah!" David's voice was tense. "What the hell is going on? Richard is losing his mind here." "I imagine he is," I replied calmly. "How can I help you, David? The accounts are frozen. The board is asking questions I can't answer. Richard says you've lost your mind, but this doesn't feel like insanity. It feels calculated. Very calculated," I agreed. 7 years of calculation, to be exact. There was a pause. "I always thought you were smarter than him," David said finally. "What do you want?" "I want what's mine, and I want Richard to understand exactly what he's lost." Another pause. "Elaine is here. She's talking about calling the police, claiming you stole from the firm." I laughed. "I'd advise against that. Everything I've done is perfectly legal, using the authority Richard himself gave me. If they want to involve the police, I'm happy to share some interesting details about how certain client accounts have been handled." This was a bluff. I had no evidence of any wrongdoing at the firm. But I knew Richard and his father well enough to suspect there were corners cut, ethical lines blurred. David's sharp intake of breath told me my arrow had hit its mark. "I'll tell them that's not advisable," he said carefully. Wise choice. I was enjoying this new dynamic, speaking to David as an equal, not as Richard's decorative wife. My lawyer will be in touch this afternoon with terms. I suggest everyone cooperate. I hung up and found Melissa staring at me with something like awe. "Who are you, and what have you done with my doormat friend?" she asked, grinning. "I finally remembered who I was," I replied. It just took an apron to remind me. My phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification. The board had called an emergency meeting for 9 a.m. Richard was temporarily suspended from all financial decisions pending investigation. The first domino had fallen, and the rest would follow in quick succession. Outside the cafe window, Boston was waking up. People hurried past, bundled against the cold, carrying shopping bags and coffee cups. Normal people living normal lives. Soon, I would be one of them again. Not Richard Thompson's wife, not Elaine Thompson's disappointing daughter-in-law, just Sarah Miller, consultant, independent woman, survivor. The day stretched before me, full of practical matters to attend to. Signing the lease on my apartment, meeting with my new employers, speaking with my lawyer. But for this moment, sitting with an old friend who had never forgotten who I really was, I allowed myself to simply breathe and feel the first tentative stirrings of freedom. The following days unfolded like scenes from a movie I was both starring in and watching from a distance. My new apartment in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood was nothing like the sprawling Connecticut house. Just a one-bedroom with tall windows and wooden floors that creaked pleasantly when I walked across them. It came furnished, which was perfect for my situation. The previous tenant had left behind a collection of houseplants that the landlord had somehow kept alive, and they gave the space a lived-in feel that I appreciated. I spent the first day setting up my new life, unpacking my meager belongings, purchasing necessities, speaking with my lawyer, a formidable woman named Janet, who had no connection to Richard's social circles, and preparing for my first day at Mercer Consulting. Throughout it all, my phone continued to light up with messages and calls from Connecticut, which I documented but largely ignored. On my second night away, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the lights of Boston twinkle against the winter sky, I finally called Richard back. It was time. He answered on the first ring. "Sarah, where the hell are you? You need to come home right now. Do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice held that familiar mix of anger and disbelief, the tone he used when anyone dared to challenge his authority. Once, it would have sent me scrambling to appease him. Now, it only confirmed I'd made the right decision. "I know exactly what I've done, Richard," I replied calmly. "I've reclaimed my life. This isn't a joke, Sarah. The board is talking about an external audit. My father is furious. My mother is beside herself. You need to undo whatever you did and come home immediately. That's not going to happen." There was a pause. Then his voice softened. The switch to the charming Richard, the one who had won me over years ago. "Look, I understand you were upset about Christmas Eve. Mom went too far with that stupid apron. I told her it was a bad idea. Let's just talk about this face to face. Whatever you want, we can work it out." I wanted respect, Richard. For 7 years, I wanted to be treated like a partner, not a servant. It's too late for that now. This is about the apron? Seriously? You've frozen our accounts, sicked the board on me, and disappeared over a gag gift? I almost laughed. The apron was just the final straw. This is about years of dismissal, disrespect, and exploitation. You used me, Richard. My skills, my labor, my business acumen, while treating me like I was nothing more than convenient help. That's ridiculous, he sputtered. I gave you everything. The house, the lifestyle, the social connections. No, I earned those things. I managed your home, your schedule, your business operations. I designed your client interface, streamlined your billing system, co-signed your loans. I made you look good to your father and his friends. And in return, you and your mother treated me like an embarrassing necessity. The line went quiet for a moment. When Richard spoke again, his voice had lost its charm and returned to the cold tone I knew was closer to his true nature. So, this is blackmail? What do you want? Money? I want what's mine, Richard. Half of everything we built together. And recognition for my contributions to your firm. You'll get nothing, he hissed. You signed a prenup, remember? Now I did laugh. A prenup that specifically excluded business assets developed during the marriage. Assets that have my name on them. Check with your lawyer, Richard. I already have. Another silence. Longer this time. I could almost hear him calculating, reassessing, realizing that I wasn't the pushover he'd always assumed I was. My father won't let this happen, he said finally, his voice tight with anger. He has connections you can't imagine. Your father is currently trying to explain to the board why his son gave his wife signing authority on all the firm's major accounts. I don't think he'll be much help to you right now. I ended the call while he was still sputtering threats. It felt good, better than I'd expected, to finally stand up to the man who had spent years subtly diminishing me. I blocked his number and Elaine's, deciding that all future communication would go through my lawyer. It was time for clean boundaries. The storm I'd set in motion continued to rage in Connecticut, while I built my new life in Boston. Through mutual friends and professional contacts, I heard snippets of the fallout. Richard's reputation was crumbling as the truth came out, how he had used my money and my labor to build everything he took credit for. His business partners, never truly loyal, began to distance themselves once they realized the firm's digital infrastructure, the part that actually made money, had been largely my creation. Elaine tried to salvage what was left of their social standing, calling relatives and friends, spinning lies about my mental state, claiming I'd had some kind of breakdown. But Boston's professional community was smaller than she realized, and many of those she reached out to were people I'd worked with before my marriage. Her attempts at character assassination backfired spectacularly when several of my former colleagues spoke up in my defense. 2 weeks after my departure, Janet called with news. "The board wants to meet with you," she said, without Richard or his father present. The meeting took place in a sleek conference room in downtown Boston. 4 men and 2 women, all in their 50s or 60s, all with the polished look of people who had spent their lives in positions of power. They asked direct technical questions about the firm's operations, the client portal I'd developed, the billing system I'd implemented. I answered honestly, without embellishment or spite. "Mrs. Thompson," began one of the women, a sharp-eyed former judge named Eleanor Bishop. "Ms. Miller," I corrected gently. "I've resumed using my maiden name." She nodded approvingly. "Ms. Miller, then. It's become clear to the board that your contributions to Thompson Legal have been significantly underrepresented. We're prepared to offer you a settlement that acknowledges your role in building the firm's current infrastructure." The figure she named made my breath catch. It was fair, more than fair. It was recognition. "There's one more thing," said Robert Cavendish, the board chairman. "We'd like to retain your services as a consultant to maintain the systems you developed. Richard and his father would not be your direct contacts, of course." I considered the offer. Working with the firm without having to deal with Richard or his father was tempting, but I knew it would keep me tethered to my past. "I appreciate the offer, but I've accepted a position with Mercer Consulting. I think a clean break would be best for everyone." They seemed to respect my decision. Papers were signed. Arrangements were made for the transfer of assets. And just like that, My financial ties to the Thompson family were severed. I walked out of that meeting with enough money to buy my own place in Boston and invest in my future, plus the professional validation I'd been denied for so long. Richard made one last attempt to contact me, showing up at my apartment building one evening in February. The doorman, already briefed about the situation, refused to let him up and called me for instructions. I asked him to tell Richard that any further contact would result in a restraining order. He never tried again. As winter melted into spring, I settled into my new role at Mercer. I bought a small but beautiful condo overlooking the Charles River, where the morning light spilled through the windows and made everything feel clean and new. I reconnected with old friends, made new ones through work, and even went on a few casual dates. Nothing serious, just baby steps toward reclaiming that part of myself as well. In time, people stopped associating my name with Richard's. In professional circles, I became known for my work, my ideas, my contributions. I was no longer Richard Thompson's wife, or the woman who walked out on Christmas, though that story did make the rounds, usually told with a mixture of admiration and scandalized delight. Instead, I was Sarah Miller, digital transformation consultant, the woman who rebuilt her life on her own terms. I stayed silent through it all, refusing interviews, declining to comment on the rumors that swirled through both Boston and Connecticut social circles. My lawyer handled the divorce proceedings efficiently, and Richard, perhaps finally understanding the damage his resistance could do to what remained of his reputation, eventually stopped fighting and signed the papers. The last I heard, his father had taken back control of the firm, sidelining Richard to a minor role with limited responsibilities. Elaine had thrown herself into charity work, seemingly determined to rehabilitate the family name through aggressive philanthropy. They were still in Connecticut, still moving through the same social circles, but with diminished shine. Their world hadn't collapsed. People like the Thompsons rarely experienced true failure, but it had contracted significantly. And while they stumbled through the mess they had created, I built something honest, something mine. Summer came to Boston in a rush of green and warmth. I'd forgotten how much I loved this city. Its brick buildings and winding streets, the way history and innovation existed side by side, the energy that hummed through the air. My condo on Beacon Street had become a true home, filled with books I actually wanted to read and art that spoke to me, not chosen to impress dinner guests or match a designer's color scheme. My work at Mercer was challenging and fulfilling. I'd been assigned to lead a team developing digital transformation strategies for traditional New England businesses, law firms, insurance companies, family-owned manufacturing operations. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was doing professionally what I'd done for Richard's firm, but now with recognition, respect, and a salary that reflected my value. "Sarah, do you have a minute?" My boss, Karen, appeared in my office doorway one afternoon in early June. The Lowell project presentation went over big. The client specifically mentioned your analysis of their workflow issues. I smiled, still not entirely used to receiving direct praise for my work. That's great to hear. They were skeptical at first about changing systems that had been in place for 3 generations. Well, you won them over. Karen sat down across from me. Which brings me to my next question. We've been invited to present at the Northeast Business Technology Conference in September. I'd like you to be our main speaker. The conference was a major industry event, attended by hundreds of executives and covered by business press. It would mean visibility, networking opportunities, and a significant step forward in establishing my professional identity separate from my past. I'd be honored, I said, feeling a flutter of both excitement and nervousness. What aspect of our work should I focus on? Your choice, Karen replied. You've got the best instincts for what resonates with traditional businesses facing digital challenges. After she left, I sat at my desk, looking out at the Charles River sparkling in the summer sun, and felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over me. 6 months ago, I had been standing in a kitchen in Connecticut, serving dinner to people who barely acknowledged my existence. Now I was being asked to share my expertise at a major conference, valued for my mind rather than my domestic skills. The divorce had been finalized in May with surprisingly little drama. Richard, perhaps finally recognizing the futility of fighting me, had agreed to a settlement slightly less generous than what the board had offered, but still more than fair. The Thompson name still opened doors in certain circles, but those doors were no longer ones I was interested in walking through. My lawyer, Janet, had called with the news. "It's done," she'd said. "You're officially Sarah Miller again, legally and financially free of Richard Thompson." That night, I'd opened a bottle of champagne and sat on my small balcony, watching the sunset over the river. The bubbles had tasted like possibility. As summer progressed, I found myself healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. I joined a rowing club that practiced on the Charles early mornings, rediscovering the physical strength and connection to my body that I'd somehow lost during my marriage. I started taking cooking classes, not to perfect dinner party menus for judgmental guests, but to explore flavors and techniques that pleased me. I began dating a professor from MIT named Daniel, who talked about algorithms with the same passion I felt for systems design, and who looked at me when I spoke as if my words actually mattered. In August, I received an unexpected email from Margaret, the one person from Richard's circle who had always treated me with kindness. She was visiting Boston for a conference and wondered if I might be free for coffee. We met at a small cafe near the public garden, both a little awkward at first, unsure of where we stood. "You look wonderful," she said, after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "There's something different about you." "Freedom looks good on me," I replied with a small smile. She laughed. "It certainly does." Her expression turned more serious. "I wanted to tell you that I've left Thompson Legal. After what happened with you and seeing how they handled it, I couldn't stay. I'm sorry if my actions caused problems for you," I said, genuinely concerned. She waved away my apology. "Don't be. It was long overdue. I've joined a firm in New York that actually values diverse perspectives and doesn't treat women like decorative accessories." She took a sip of her coffee. "Richard and Elaine still talk about you, you know. Their version of events has evolved from Sarah had a nervous breakdown to Sarah was secretly plotting against us all along." I couldn't help but laugh. "And which version do people believe?" "Neither," Margaret said with a smile. "Most people who were at that Christmas Eve dinner saw exactly what happened. The apron incident has become something of a cautionary tale in certain circles. The thought of my former life as a cautionary tale should have bothered me, but instead I found it oddly satisfying. Perhaps some other woman married to some other condescending man would benefit from hearing about the quiet wife who finally stood up for herself." September arrived with a crispness in the air and the energy of new beginnings that always seems to permeate Boston when the students return. I spent hours preparing for the conference presentation, determined to demonstrate my expertise without any reference to my past. This would be Sarah Miller's professional debut, untethered from the Thompson name or history. The night before the conference, I received a text from Melissa, who had become my most loyal supporter through the upheaval of the past year. "Guess who I just heard is registered for the conference tomorrow? Richard's father. Apparently Thompson Legal is finally looking to modernize their systems now that you're gone." My stomach tightened at the news. The elder Thompson had never been overtly unkind to me, but he had watched his son and wife diminish me for years without intervention. The thought of seeing him in the audience during my presentation was unsettling, but as I stood at the podium the next day, looking out at the sea of faces, I realized something important. I wasn't afraid. If William Thompson was in the audience, and yes, there he was, third row, looking older than I remembered, it didn't matter. My worth was no longer tied to his family's approval. My presentation focused on helping traditional businesses maintain their core values while embracing necessary technological change, something I understood intimately from both professional and personal experience. I spoke clearly and confidently, answering questions with authority, even exchanging a few light-hearted moments with the audience. When it was over, the applause was warm and genuine. As people approached afterward with business cards and follow-up questions, I caught sight of William Thompson hovering at the edge of the group. Our eyes met briefly across the room. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledgement, perhaps even respect, before turning and walking away. It was closure of a sort, though not one I had sought or needed. That evening, I hosted a small dinner party in my condo. Melissa and her husband, Daniel, Karen and her partner, and 2 colleagues from Mercer. I cooked a simple but delicious meal, opened good wine, and created the kind of warm, genuine atmosphere that had always been absent from the formal dinners in Connecticut. As we sat around my table, laughing and talking, I felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what sharing a meal should be. A genuine connection between people who valued each other, not a performance to impress or a duty to fulfill. Christmas was approaching again. This year, I wouldn't be cooking for people who saw me as less. I wouldn't be silenced by fake smiles or forced to swallow my pride. I'd accepted an invitation to spend the holiday with Melissa and her family in Vermont. People who had known me before Richard, who had never forgotten who I really was. The apron? I'd kept it, oddly enough. I'd framed it, along with the note, not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of everything I would never accept again. I hung it in my hallway, right by the door, so I saw it every time I walked out into the world I'd reclaimed. Sometimes visitors asked about it, confused by this strange piece of art in my otherwise tasteful home. I simply told them it was a reminder that we teach people how to treat us by what we accept, what we allow, what we forgive. I learned that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's the wind-up before a storm, and sometimes the calmest woman in the room is the one holding all the strings. They gave me a box to put me in my place. I used it to rise. 1 year after that Christmas Eve that changed everything, I stood on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching the lights of Boston twinkle against the winter sky. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel, confirming our dinner plans. My laptop sat open on the coffee table, displaying the draft of a book proposal my agent was excited about. Digital Transformation and Personal Reclamation: How Businesses and People Evolve. I thought about the woman I had been, standing in a kitchen in Connecticut, trying desperately to earn love and respect from people incapable of giving either. And I thought about the woman I was now. Strong, valued, whole. That woman in Connecticut hadn't been completely powerless. She'd been gathering strength, knowledge, and resources even as she folded napkins and served dinner. She'd been waiting for the moment when enough would finally be enough, when the right catalyst, something as simple as a cheap apron and a cruel note, would finally break the spell of obligation and insecurity that kept her bound. I raised my glass to her, to myself, to the journey between these two versions of Sarah Miller. The apron had been meant as an insult, a reminder of my place. Instead, it had become the key to my freedom, the permission I needed to finally walk away. Some people might call what I did revenge. I called it reclamation. I had taken back my name, my power, my future. And in doing so, I had discovered something valuable. Sometimes the strongest response to cruelty isn't a shouted confrontation or a dramatic scene, but a quiet, determined realignment of your life away from those who cannot see your worth. I had found my place at last. It was here, in this life I had built for myself, surrounded by people who valued me for exactly who I was, and that was worth celebrating.